Welcome to Within the Frame, where we bring the most pressing issues across the globe into focus. I'm Kim Mok-yeon. South Africa is set to host this year's G20 Summit November 22nd, marking a historic moment as the only African country at the table for presidency. As global power dynamics shift and competition over supply chains intensifies, attention is turning to Africa's strategic role, especially in the critical minerals sector. Seoul, under President Lee Jae Myung's leadership, is strengthening efforts to secure essential resources and expand economic partnerships on the continent. His first official visit to South Africa signals a broader push for deeper bilateral cooperation, not only in minerals, but also in infrastructure, energy, and industrial development. For a deeper exploration on this, we were joined in the studio by Timothy Dickens, chairman of the South African Chamber of Commerce in Korea. A big welcome.
Good evening. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us. So let's begin right away with, of course, the G20 Summit. It's scheduled to be held tomorrow. So since South Africa is the only African member of the G20, what is the significance of this presidency this year?
Well, I think firstly, it's an excellent time to put South Africa on the map in terms of the world focus in view. We're not actually the only African country. We have the African Union, which was joined as a member last year officially during the Brazil proceedings. But I think strategically, and the importance of South Africa as the chair this year, I think is one of two things. Number one, I think the globe is starting to realize that Africa and the region as a whole needs to be at the table and the conversation rather than as a periphery. So I think as the chair for this presidency this year, it's important because South Africa can, A, focus on its strategic policies from a global perspective, but also local domestic policies, and B, also focus on Africa's policies. So although we're focusing from South African perspective, we also need to cover what the African needs are. And I think at this stage in the global sort of policy making in view, it's starting to rebalance where I think there's been a bit of misbalance where slightly smaller frontier type countries and markets have not been in those discussions. And if we are looking at a global perspective for longevity and inclusivity, very important for South Africa to be as a president of the committee this year.
Right, so it definitely sounds like a good opportunity to listen to the voice of Africa at the table. Now, building on that, let's get into the key agenda items that South Africa has put on as the G20 chair, and also tell us how critical are these topics in the current global landscape.
Well, I think South Africa has built their G20 presidency in terms of framing it under three particular strands, or let's put it for want of better words. So one is solidarity, two is equality, and the third one is sustainability. So if we break those down into the three, if we look at solidarity, I think in today's markets and world, we are faced with just a phenomenal, almost a sort of geopolitical crisis. There are epidemics in terms of COVID that we had, in terms of the climate, there are disasters, hurricanes, etc., that are happening all the time. There are trade issues in terms of tariffs that are flying all around. And these make it extremely difficult, particularly for smaller based countries, frontier markets, where they don't have that buffer. So the moment something goes wrong, they are in big trouble. So in terms of solidarity, how do we as a world, and that includes everyone at the table, to say, what do we need to look at in terms of formulating policy, agenda, global strategy for long-term togetherness to make sure that we are protecting those that, where there are difficulties and they can't manage that buffer part, how do we protect that? On the second leg, on the equality part, I think the South African focus has also been particularly on the financial equality. And this we can get into a bit of depth on, because I think it's quite strategic to understand why this is important. So if we look at Africa as a whole, as a continent, in terms of the requirements for energy, in particular, I think 60% of African households still do not have access to basic electricity, which is phenomenal. B, the need for inputting infrastructure, particularly energy infrastructure, is critical, because without energy, we can't produce any other sectors. So that's a very critical part. Now the difficulty comes when we are looking at the global financing sort of institutes, the private financing sector. They have very particular tick boxes which they need to tick off. Now, one of those in particular is it an investment grade country? Africa has probably 2 countries, maybe Botswana and Mauritius being the 2 exceptions, but the rest are not investment grade. That means when you're looking for financing for investment into these infrastructure and energy projects, the pool is already cut by half because of these limitations which they have. The second point then, even on the half that are able to do the financing for the infrastructure, they are looking for increased financing rates as opposed to, let's say, North American or European rates because of the perception that there's more risk to do investment into Africa. And that creates a very big difficulty in terms of raising infrastructure financing. African Development Bank came out last year or 2 with their report in terms of the critical financing needs for infrastructure projects on the continent. And the shortage for financing that's required for these infrastructure projects on a yearly basis is about 100 to 150 billion USD. So we're talking a huge amount of difference. So I think equality in terms of how does the world strategize and equal this perception in terms of financing ability. I'll give an example in terms of Korea's overseas foreign direct investment. In 2024, of the sort of 65 billion USD that was put out into the world, 1% went to Africa. So if we're talking about equality, we really need to have this very serious discussion to say we need to level the playing fields. And then the last point is the sustainability, and I think that speaks across a number of different sectors. We've got ESG requirements, critical mineral supply chains. How do we make this sustainable? Because if we're not looking at the long term and longevity of the globe as a whole, we're going to run into serious issues. And one of those in particular is also food supply. As the global population increases, we need to make sure that we have food security. So I think having these discussions on the table is very important. And it has to be from a global perspective and not just certain jurisdictions or areas that are more the policy makers.
Well, now that we've heard about the current situation from you, I think those agenda items definitely would carry a lot of weight this time around. Now, so in light of this G20, South Korean President Lee Jae Myung is, of course, making his first visit to South Africa since he took office. So what kind of cooperation is South Africa actually hoping from President Lee's latest visit?
Well, it's great that President Lee, one of his first visits is actually to Africa and South Africa. But I think in terms of what South Africa will be looking for is probably a number of different sectors. I think firstly, support. Korea has a big voice in terms of the global economy. So in terms of supporting South Africa and African policies on the global stage, I think that will be very important. Then secondly, I think they'll be looking at developing the MOUs which were signed during the Korea-Africa Summit last year. And I'd say particularly on the energy sector, in terms of MOUs, how Korea and Africa and South Africa in particular can work together. And likewise, I think in the critical mineral space, in terms of developing those MOUs, I think those are 3 critical areas where we would dearly like to see a deeper cooperation, and hopefully President Lee will do that.
Let's definitely look forward to that. Now, let's get a little bit deeper into the bilateral relationship between South Korea and South Africa. So the key of this cooperation is, of course, critical minerals, and which are, of course, essential for cutting-edge industries as well. So Korea designated its top 10 critical minerals and is strengthening oversight. So from this standpoint, what is South Africa's strategic value?
I think the strategic value is phenomenal. And let me break that down. So in terms of the Korea security for their critical minerals, their plan, and you've mentioned these top 10 sort of golden eggs which they want, South Africa actually ticks a number of those boxes. So particularly in manganese, vanadium, we have the largest resources in the world, rare earths, and then the platinum group minerals. Now, all of these minerals are very essential to things like all the renewable products, EV batteries, defense systems, and even the electronics. South Africa has those already. But in addition to that, one needs to look at South Africa in terms of its geography. We have, in terms of the trading route, I think of the 10 biggest ports in Africa, South Africa has 4 of those. So we've got Richards Bay, you've got Durban, you've got the Port of Nkura, and down in Cape Town. Now, when we look at critical minerals, it's not just South Africa. You can look at our neighbors, for example, Botswana, Zimbabwe, Angola, who do not have access to the seaports, and that can come through South Africa. So if we're looking at developing a plan, yes, South Africa is critical to that, but we also need to look at it from a broader perspective. So our neighbors also have, where we do not have certain of those critical minerals of the top 10, Botswana has, Zimbabwe has. So I think if you use South Africa as your base, very important, and I think that's going to be strategic for Korea, because in the critical mineral space, it's a bun fight out there, and Africa has the resource, but we need the partners with the technology.
So you've mentioned this a very high competitiveness in terms of geographical aspects, but we're also aware that China really still has a strong grip on Africa's mineral supply chains. So where do you think Korea can actually set itself apart, not just as a buyer, but also a partner in things like refining, processing, or even industrial development on the ground?
I think the last part of your question is critical, the partnership in terms of the refining, the industrialization, and that's the key part. We get this question a lot in terms of Korean companies looking for projects on the continent. Well, China's already in there. How do we carve out our piece of the pie? Africa is massive. As I mentioned, there's a huge amount of potential, and it's almost like a blue ocean in terms of projects and availability of different projects. I think where Korea plays a very key part and offers a different model to what China does, for example, is looking at that longevity as a partner. And by partner, we mean we are walking this road together for the next 20, 30, 40 years. And that partnership needs to be joint ventures, joint collaboration on all of these different projects. Korea is and has always been very good at technology transfer, sharing information, and being that partner. And I think by creating this longevity and partnership and truly saying we're going to hold hands and walk down this road for the next 20, 30 years, it's going to be critical. The difficulty is, of course, there needs to be a lot of upfront investment, because we need to extract, we need to process, and then we need to bifurcate all of these products for selling on the markets. So there has to be a bit of patience. I think sometimes that idea of having to pali for everything, 1 or 2 years for return on investments, that's not the way to look at it. So we need to look at a long-term relationship between the two.
So we should be a little bit patient.
Patient, but very driven to say we are very definitive in this is the road that we're going to walk together.
Right, so we're going to look forward to that strong partnership moving forward, But beyond minerals, there's also multiple areas for cooperation between the two sides. So which industries do you think could actually offer, the fastest entry point for Korean companies?
I think energy is right up there. And let me start with South Africa as an example for energy. So even South Africa, we suffered a lot of energy shortages over the last 10 years, which is only just recovered. We called it load shedding, where 2-3 hours a day you have a blackout for energy. And that eats into all industrialization. You can't even, for example, put energy to the pumps to pump water for agricultural purposes. Our government was very strategic and put in place a number of policies. One which was to lift all licensing and regulations for electricity production, which meant that private sector could then take over. They've been very good in putting in place a lot of renewable energy, but the difficulty is now we've produced enough electricity, but we can't get it out in terms of the transmission lines. We are already congested. So South Africa has a plan over the next 10 years to roll out around 15,000 kilometers of transmission lines. Now that is a massive undertaking. And here's where Korea has a key. Already on the ground in South Africa, we have KEPCO, we have KEPCO KPS. They are already working with Eskom, which is our utility, our KEPCO of South Africa, for doing line maintenance of certain of the power stations. You've got Hyundai Heavy Industries, which did the first battery energy project in South Africa. You've got a joint venture with MTech, which is through Taehan Cable and Steel Suppliers. So already there's Team Korea on the ground to roll out these projects, for example, on the transmission lines. Likewise, on the nuclear side, KEPCO is very involved in South Africa in terms of discussions with nuclear, and that our government released its IRP, which is the Integrated Resource Plan just last month, which includes a very big portion of nuclear. And that's where Korea has great technology and has a very good reputation within South Africa. On another energy part is green hydrogen. Korea itself will require a lot of import of green hydrogen and ammonia to also meet its carbon reduction levels. South Africa has a massive project in terms of its Hive green energy, as does Namibia. So you've got almost a corridor of green hydrogen production. Korea has great technology within those sectors. So as a very basic entry point, energy is fantastic. And one last point on that is the infrastructure in terms of rail. They're liberalizing the rail sector. So it was owned by a state-owned entity, Transnet. They are privatizing this. And I think, as mentioned, in terms of moving goods to and fro, whether it's critical minerals, etc., down to the ports, you have Hyundai Rotem, you have Korea Rail would be very, very good in those sectors.
Right, so we hear that there are a lot of opportunities for cooperation in the energy sector as well. But I recall that in a recent interview, you've mentioned that when South Africa actually holds presidency of the G20, it would actually be a golden window for Korean businesses to actually enter Africa. Could you elaborate on that for our viewers?
Well, I think we've been very lucky because, like all things in life, it's about momentum and eyes on a certain area, and that has been Africa and South Africa within that. It started with COVID because suddenly supply chains were being looked at to say, we need to look at alternatives to what we traditionally have. We then had Korea, which was bidding for the Busan Expo, sent a lot of delegations out to South Africa and Africa to go and develop those relationships. After that, we then had the Korea-Africa Summit, the inaugural one last year, so all eyes were on Africa. So that momentum's been building, and now we've got the G20. Whether that's by design or that's been just happened by chance, it doesn't matter. The momentum's there, and I think the more the focus is on the region, the more eyes are, the more discussions, for example, we're having in studio now to open up these discussions. I think the time is right now. I do also think that the time for Korean companies to move is now, because the rest of the world is also moving towards Africa. So if we fall asleep behind the wheel, we're going to miss out.
So now could be a very important timing for us. Now, on a related note, that we also hear that the Korea International Trade Association, the KITA, recently opened its first ever African office in South Africa. What does this actually symbolize for us? And also, what's needed to ensure these kinds of momentum would continue?
Well, I think that's fantastic from KITA, and all credit to them. And this is off the back of last year's Korea-Africa Summit, where they were the actual main host for the formal business roundtable discussions. And this is one of the outcomes of that, which means that they're putting their money where their mouth is. B, I think it's important because you get boots on the ground. The moment you have the people on the ground, those discussions, you build the relationships, you build the partnerships. To give you an idea, KITA's office is in the same building as Kotra, in the same building as K-SURE. So already there's a Team Korea element that's building within that. We were out 2 weeks ago for the official opening, and it was fantastic. We had a delegation of Korean companies, of about 20 Korean companies and 20 South African companies, having very in-depth discussions on these very specific business opportunities. So I think that is a fantastic development that's happened, and well done on KITA.
We'll look forward to more of those. Now, lastly, before we let you go, as the chairman of the South African Chamber of Commerce in Korea, how would you hope to see the Korea-South Africa relations to develop in the coming years?
Oh, I have fantastic ideas. But no, generally, I think I'd like to sit in 5 years' time and maybe come back to this office and say, our trade has increased by 10%. At the moment, Korea's trade with Africa as a whole is 1%. If we can shift that to 10%, that means there's a lot more interaction, there's a lot more partnerships forming, there's a lot more relationships forming. That would be a fantastic first step. I'd also like people in Seoul and in Johannesburg, for that fact, to look at each other across the pond and not just see it as a country that's somewhere unknown and unfamiliar, but as, oh, this is our partner. These are our people that we're working with to develop both of our countries on an equal and fair footing.
Right. Let's definitely hope for the trade volume to increase and for more partnerships to be more partnerships between the two countries moving forward. And thank you so much for your time tonight, Chairman Dickens. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
And that'll be all from us on Within the Frame. Be sure to tune in again next time as we continue to explore the stories that matter. Until then, stay informed and engaged.